Oh. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Can someone just confirm whether you can hear me or not? Meet echoes pretty good.
I can hear you, Rick.
Excellent. Thank you, Ed. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the DTN interim meeting. I have an apology to start with. As I mentioned in the chat, I was on vacation last week for 2 weeks and I picked up COVID on the way home. So I'm a little bit groggy and I'm still making strange coughing noises, which is unpleasant for me, and I will attempt to mute my microphone before doing so. I'm also going to rely quite heavily on Ed to do a fair amount of the talking today. Um, and that's my cue to cough. Ed, do you want to just take over for a second with some of the admin trivia, and I'll get around to sharing my screen, etc.
Sure, absolutely. Again, as Rick said, welcome to the interim meeting. We had really two things that we wanted to make sure that we covered, and the interim meeting is a little bit less formal than the typical working group meetings in that we don't have PowerPoint slides to go through, because I think really what we want to do is focus on the IPN internet draft that Rick has put up. There were some comments coming from the mailing list as to ways in which we wanted to update this. We did not put out a new version of that, and honestly, putting a new version out, the day before or a few days before the interim meeting probably doesn't make a lot of sense. So the plan was for us to take really the bulk of this meeting and walk through that document. That document, in addition to proposing an extension to IPN, also has a section that tries to capture some of the concerns that were associated with not extending IPN based on the mailing list, and use that and a screen share to talk through what we think should and should not be incorporated. If there is time remaining on the agenda, we do have a little bit of an update to talk through on network management, but we can also do that at IETF 115. Really the bulk of this and the success criteria for us is making sure we make some decisions related to IPN naming today. So that's what I've got.
Thanks, Ed. So just for sort of general administrivia. So this is an IETF meeting, so this is covered by the IETF note well. We would normally show this on the screen, but frankly, as Ed said, we haven't done any slides for this because we didn't seem they're particularly useful, but you are now formally warned. This is a standard IETF meeting and therefore covered under the note well. Please go and check the note well on the IETF resources page if you are not familiar with it. If someone's feeling particularly efficient, could they post a link to it in the chat? There is a meeting note-taking tool as ever built into MeetEcho. Please feel free to use that if you wish to make some minutes on this, although a recording of this will be made and automatically and will be available after the event for people to watch again. But as Ed said, we're not being particularly formal about this, but it is an official IETF meeting. What I'm sharing on the screen at the moment is actually the raw markdown of the draft. So I published two versions, co-written with Ed. Simply, it's not entirely my own work, although I'm probably the primary typist. I write it in Markdown because it's really convenient to edit, but it also means we can make live changes now. So what we thought we'd do is almost workshop this document, because although it's a personal draft at the moment, I think it might be a good candidate for working group adoption. Very happy to receive feedback and make comments within my own working copy at the moment, push out another copy, and then we'll discuss that at IETF 115 to see whether the working group does like it, whether we're willing to adopt it, that sort of thing. So what's quite important to remember here is, although both Ed and I are chairs of DTN, we're also authors of this. So when we're talking about this document, we are very much personal contributors to the working group. These are personal drafts, and you should ignore the fact that we happen to chair the working group at the same time. And we promise that this is not a conflict of interest, and we're not abusing our position of power to flag way for our own opinions. So one thing I do want to draw out first off is I'm going to do a show of hands because I quite like the show of hands tool in this, just to say how many people have actually read the draft, and I pushed out 2 copies back to back about 24 hours apart. So I'm going to just say either copy. The reason for asking that is it kind of gives me some indication of how much background to do. So of 10, oh, I'm watching the numbers roaring up, which is great. So so 3/4 is what I'm seeing at the moment. So 9 out of 12, which is pretty good. I better put my own hand up. Okay. So of those who have not read the draft, well, no, this is an open question. I'm running out of breath already. Ed, do you want to give a little summary for this while I mute myself and have a cough, if that's okay? I don't think we need to spend too long summarizing this, and then I'd quite like to get into some of the Q&A.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So for those who have not had a chance to read the draft, one of the observations made was that the original IPN naming scheme, or the current, really, I should say IPN naming scheme, because this is a proposal, says that the IPN name is the 2-tuple of a node number and a service number, and there's something very good and powerful about the fact that we could represent a named entity as a single integer as a node, and enumerate, therefore, entities in the network. The observation was that when that individual node number represents something that has meaning within a locally administered domain, then the control of that and the allocation of those numbers is probably manageable. But if we wanted to extend this to be more of a global uniqueness, then having a single flat number space for nodes may become very difficult to manage. And so we looked at other things that tried to tackle these similar problems. One of those other things were things like MAC addresses, or EUI 48s or EUI 64s or whatnot. And one of the ways in which this was sliced to be more scalable was the introduction of an organization number or a numbering authority, and then node numbers are relative to that numbering authority, which would turn, if adopted, which would turn the IPN naming scheme, instead of into node number dot service number, it would turn it into something more like numbering authority dot node number dot service number. And then there are a couple of different flavors of that. So really the fundamental questions here are whether a single flat node numbering namespace can work in a global distribution. And if not, then is the idea of tagging organizations as a numbering authority the thing that gets us a more scalable solution. So that's really the purpose, the primary purpose of this document. And then a secondary purpose is to go back and make very clear that for Bundle Protocol version 7, there are registries associated with the use of IPN and the organizations for node numbering and service numbering, whereas it's a little bit, people have expressed confusion to us as to what registries to look at for what purposes. And I see... Yep.
Go ahead, Alberto.
Thanks, Rick and Ed. Is it time for Q&A now, or?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome.
Go for it, by all means.
Awesome. Thanks. First, let me start by saying, thank you for putting this together. This is a great, a great topic for discussion. I have a very, very generic question. That's why I raised my hand, early on. Is there any urgency to discuss this? And let me elaborate. Is there any impending event, organization that is working towards this? The reason I'm asking is because this is a very fundamental change. So want to understand whether the approach here would be for, hey, let's make sure that we analyze and reanalyze these, versus, no, we need to move fast because of X, Y, or Z. Just trying to, understand a little bit the situation.
So I can certainly jump in briefly on that and say fast is certainly a relative term. So I think fast in this case is there is a question as to whether or not an extension to IPN is useful, and then what that extension would be, with the idea that putting something through working group last call in November and then getting it through a standard process in subsequent meetings, it probably puts us on an arc of many, many months, not many, many weeks. So that's my initial comment, but I also see that Scott is in the queue, so maybe he has a comment on that.
Hi. My comment is actually not so much on that. It's on the question of whether a flat numbering space can be used. And what I would offer there is that clearly it can be used. And I think the draft explains how it, based on node number ranges that are assigned to numbering authorities, is a mechanism that is contemplated in the current CBHE registries. The question really is not whether it can be used. The question is whether it's desirable. And I think the advantage of adding additional structure to the node naming in this scheme is compression. It enables very small node numbers to be used by many different organizations without requiring that every node number be 16 bits long. And I think there's a real performance advantage in that header compression was the idea for CBHE in the first place. But I think that's the criterion we should be using for determining whether or not to go ahead with this idea is the operational advantage that you get from the header compression.
Can I just jump in to answer Alberto's question for a second? My reasoning for kicking off this document, and we were talking about timeliness, is there some pressing need to get the to look at some of my perceived issues with IPN? I had started to, within the context of the updated charter for the working group, we're looking at naming and addressing. Lots of people started to discuss this. I know myself, I looked at IPN. I had a lot of side conversations with people who were using IPN. And through my investigation, I started to uncover that there was some confusion about how to use it successfully. There wasn't really a consistent document which pulled it all together. So although I am unaware of any pressing industrial or big space mission that is going to require an update, some breaking change to occur, I think it is timely to do this work now. If there is, and I believe there is, the need for a bit of clarification and perhaps a bit of enhancement to the IPN encoding, I think now is a very good time to do it before the working group gets further into naming, addressing, forwarding, let alone touching routing. So that was my personal reasons and my answer to, is this pressing?
Thanks, Rick, and Ed. I appreciate it. And the reason, I was asking the question was also to, I think one thing that would benefit is to, look at the specific examples in the upcoming, meetings, because I think there is some, I wouldn't say confusion, but I don't think there is general agreement into, how much of these authority is going to be used for, forwarding versus, how you treat that in a multi agency or multi organization scenario. So examples would help a lot, at least to to me and the work we're doing, just to make sure that we fully understand the scope.
So yes, you make a very valid point there, which I probably should have called out. And Scott, yes, I can see you in the queue. Sorry, 1 second. This whole thing is about interoperable behavior. So this is kind of under the remit of the IETF. The IETF is about interoperability between cooperating parties. If you want to use IPN for your own purposes within your own closed system and don't need to talk to anyone else, great. Knock yourself out. You don't need a standard for that. You can go and have fun. Bundle Protocol version 7 will work beautifully for you. Use your own naming. When you want to interoperate, it starts to become important. And all the proposed changes I've made in this document are to make that interoperability easier to administrate, easier to manage, and easier to use. So interoperability is the key point. And yeah, I will make a note to do some nice worked examples, although I don't want to talk about routing. It's difficult.
Sure.
Scott, go ahead.
I just want to agree with you that the time to make this change is now. I think the sooner we do it, the better off we all are. If we're going to do it at all, we want to do it at the beginning and not have to wait until after there's been huge deployment using the scheme the way it's currently defined. So I think doing it now makes a lot of sense. And I also agree that while I think the specification of the IPN scheme in RFC 9171 is clear, what is not clear is what registries you can use to do that node number assignment, because they are labeled CBHE, which is not correct. They refer to the wrong document. That kind of thing clearly needs to be straightened out, and I think it's certainly time to do that.
So that's a very valid point again, Scott. Sorry, we had a conversation with Zahed, our AD, about how to update that registration, because we had noticed that the IANA registries were called slightly misleading things. We'd had a number of questions. The correct way to update that in IETF world is to publish a document. So we kind of knew we had to write a document anyway, and that was a great way to drive us to say, well, actually, if we're writing this anyway, let's try and address some of these other points. It might be the case, and I'm perfectly open to a suggestion from the working group to say, actually, Rick, make these two documents, one which just addresses the IANA registration naming thing, and bring in this whole sub-allocating authority business and these extra dotted authorities as a different draft. We can debate them separately. That is an open question. It's just text. I'm not that precious about it. Joshua, do you want to go ahead?
Can y'all hear me? There we go.
Yeah.
So is there any concern with the general size of allocatable node numbers, or is this strictly a people kind of wanting structure to put on top of it instead of just a simple flat network?
So from my perspective, because of the way CBOR is encoded, and Carsten is on the call and he will correct me if I make a single CBOR error here, numbers less than 23 can be encoded in 1 octet. As soon as you have integers greater than 23, you start to need more octets quite quickly. So that results in a race for low numbers. And if we use a single numbering space, and as it stands in RFC 9171, you've got 2 to the 64 bits to play with. With a first come first served access to that numbering space, if you're not at the head of the queue, you have to have overly long encodings in order to interoperate with the lucky people who got the shorter encodings. And that's the main pressure. It's one of the main drivers I saw to say, well, actually, by using a different way of encoding effectively as a prefix octet, as a prefix number, the ability 1.1.1 and 2.1.1 are still both quite nice encodings, and tries to avoid that race to be an early adopter and to grab the low numbers.
So I
That was
guess what
bad
I was gonna
explanation.
kind of suggest and mention from that then is this might not be something anybody wants whatsoever, but I'll go ahead and throw it out there. Would it be a possible option to extend the usage of the report to EID to effectively also act as your authority identifier? At which point the IPN scheme stays exactly the way it currently is. And then if you need to or want to do more of the low number system or whatever, then you could use the report to EID to establish effectively what the authority is. And now you have your degrees of separation there.
Okay, I've got
What I'm specifically envisioning is kind of along the lines of with a different type of thing that's being worked on, the IMC or interplanetary multicast stuff, with the idea of having your edge nodes or interregional routers or whatnot, that you would effectively have a named singular edge router that could quote unquote be in the reply to EID space. And then you have your separation between networks, and you can again use your lower IPNs within without necessarily having to cover that.
I'm going to make a very quick comment, and then I've seen Ed has immediately jumped to the queue on this one, and I'm going to shut up for a second. I know where you're going with this. I think that leads you in the direction of bundle-in-bundle encapsulation. I think you're absolutely fine to do that, but that's where you're effectively tunneling from one addressing domain to another addressing domain and having to encap and decap on the way through. I think that will work very well. So effectively what you're doing is network address translation, rather than extending the address space to allow for a single homogeneous interoperable address space. I think it's something I've certainly discussed with Scott and a few other people. It's quite a nice way of doing other things, but it's network address translation rather than extending the address space to allow everyone to do it without that extra CPU work. Ed, do you want to jump in, or Adam, you got a comment?
So I can jump in real quick first. What I would say is to agree with what Rick said, but I would also be hesitant to redefine in an RFC 9171 way the meaning of the report to EID. It is certainly the case in some network architectures that the report to EID would have some administrative relationship with the bundle source as well. But that is not necessarily the case. And if we were to draw that distinction with a characteristic of the report to EID and some sort of authority or administrative domain, I'd have to go back and check. I'm concerned that that is a new concept in what that field would mean. And I don't really want to change the behavior of bundle for that purpose. But maybe Scott will correct me because I see him just jumping up as well.
Quickly
jump in front of Adam, but I will try to speak very quickly. Just that I think having a single naming authority indication in the bundle is probably not sufficient, because the source and destination might have been named by different authorities. So I think each endpoint ID is going to need its own authority identification if we're going to use this mechanism. And I will now shut up.
Go ahead, Adam.
I will just say that I would agree and throw my hat in the ring of saying maybe it should be two separate documents, because you're doing an update to the registries. And while I like the idea of combining it, maybe having it separate. So it's just like, yeah, we're making this change. This is really easy, really fast. It just goes through because we know it needs to be done. And then we can dig deeper on the changes to the schemes. That's all I had to say.
So I didn't leave the queue, so let me jump in real quick because I'm still in the queue. A question that I have about that is the decision on whether node numbers are under the auspices of a numbering authority or not might determine the node number registries that you have. So in the draft that Rick is projecting here, there is a quote unquote registry for node numbers, but I think it just says they are all reserved with the idea that they are reserved, not standardized, because they are under the auspices of a numbering authority. If that is not the design decision, then really, if that is the design decision, then we need a registry of authorities, not a registry of node numbers or node number ranges. So that may impact whether they're two documents or one. The design of one is going to clearly impact the design of the other. The other thing I wanted to mention, so that was a comment. The question here is just to repeat a question that I'm seeing come up a couple of times in the chat, which is sort of, again, a fundamental question of, do we need to extend the existing IPN naming scheme, or do we define a brand new IPN scheme or a brand new scheme and call it something like extended IPN? And I think that was also addressed here, but I will simply call out that question was asked, and maybe we can talk about that based on what's projected on the screen.
So can I answer that? So I put a discussion points at the bottom of this document to try and capture the answers to some of those questions, and I absolutely agree with the question. So I had a draft which wasn't published called IPN3 to sort of capture the fact that, oh, we've got a sort of a three tuple of address, and it's perhaps different. Fundamentally, if you think about the processing that a receiving bundle processing node does when it receives an IPN number, either an IPN3 new scheme identifier or the existing scheme identifier with a different arity for the different dimension for the array that makes up the EID itself, the behavior is identical. It just hits an error case one octet later. So actually, and I suggest reading this. I don't really want to read it through, but fundamentally it goes, oh, I've got an EID. I either don't recognize the scheme because it's IPN3 because that didn't exist when I went into service, so therefore I don't recognize it. Or, oh, it's an IPN scheme. That's great. How many dimensions are there to the IPN thing? 3. Oh, I wasn't aware that such a thing existed. Same error. So I think functionally there is no difference. So the only reason for having a different scheme, well, I can't think of a good reason to have a different scheme rather than it gives a sort of pleasing acronym. But I think it's actually worse than saying it's just the IPN scheme. That's my argument. It's not a great argument. Sorry. Go ahead, Joshua.
So I would say this is probably just personal preference here, but from my standpoint, where I work with the Marshall Space Flight Center and the ISS, it would be more frustrating to have to try and figure out how to fix our systems to allow for both options than it would be to simply say that this new scheme is legitimately just a new scheme. I guess towards kind of maintaining interoperability with legacy elements. A little bit there.
Go on, Scott.
That's actually the sort of issue that I was focusing on in the email that I sent out yesterday, proposing that that we can institute this change to the scheme and limit the impact on existing implementations if if the sizes of authority numbers, sub-authority numbers, and node numbers are restricted in such a way that you can transform an authority qualified EID into a single unassigned long integer for internal use within the implementation, just by slapping everything together with some bit shifting. That would limit the impact on implementations to just parsing and construction, and remove the need for operations, internal operations on endpoint IDs to be modified to have to deal with endpoint IDs in the form of structures or arrays rather than simple integers. So I think, Josh, I think your point is very well taken. But I think Rick is correct that if we can readily and simply modify the existing IPN scheme, the impact on NASA and the impact on users of the various existing implementations, I think, can be minimized, and it gets us into an interoperability future where NASA is not excluded from the broader solar system internet just because it doesn't know how to parse and deal with the endpoint IDs. So I think that would be a particularly bad impact of making this change.
So I'll just jump in and say two things. One is that, Josh, when we talk about existing implementations, the question there is, are these implementations, again, assuming a local administrated network? Right? So one of the things that I see in this document, this proposed extension, is that a two-tuple IPN address, a name, is still valid. You can say IPN 1.1, and the idea is that the organization is assumed to be locally administered. So if the idea is that there is a relatively small deployment of that, then there may not be really any changes required if in that network you're still using essentially a local administrative domain for backwards compatibility. However, if your node is 4 billion and you want everyone in the world to know that 4 billion means you, that becomes perhaps more difficult to manage and maintain. In which case, I am not against Scott's proposal to say, are there reasonable thresholds to put on things with an eye towards whether or not that enables efficient encodings. I certainly see standards make decisions based on what may or may not entice firmware implementation or other kinds of implementation. So I think that that's a valid discussion that should also be had. So my 2 points.
My deep concern here is that I really want us, if possible, not to do something that will make it prohibitively expensive for NASA to participate in the broader solar system internet with this in this interoperability system. That the idea that maybe SpaceX and Blue Origin and Jackson, everybody forms the solar system internet, and NASA cannot be in it because it doesn't know how to deal with the endpoint IDs that everybody's using. I think that would be a great pity. I think that'd be bad for what we've been trying to do for the last 22 years.
So I'm just going to jump in just before you, Joshua. Sorry, I should put myself in the queue here. I'm being a bad citizen. I'm going to say one thing. I don't think the status quo is satisfactory. So I'm going to flag wave here to say there needs to be some change. Relying on allocations in the CBHE registry, which were for Bundle Protocol version 6, for Bundle Protocol version 7 implementations, and just assuming that that's not going to work. There's a lot of supposition that that's the right way to go, and it's not built on any solid foundation. So some sort of clarity has to occur, whether that is a new scheme or an update to IPN specifically. I prefer the latter, but I think one of those two options has to occur. Doing nothing, I don't believe, is an option. Go ahead, Joshua.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with you on that point. And again, there are probably some ways that we can mitigate some of these things just internally for the ISS stuff. But one of the things that inevitably, even though as a developer, I can deal with realizing what's going on in my mind from an operator's perspective, I know inevitably on the ISS, we will end up having to combine usage of BP version 6 with BP version 7. And it's minimal, but there is a certain amount of worry from my perspective that using the same IPN nomenclature to define two separate ways of how it's supposed to look might enter some slight confusion there. It wouldn't necessarily cause a giant issue, but I can foresee that happening at the very least. And again, there's
Sorry, it's important to remember Bundle Protocol version 6 and Bundle Protocol version 7 are not wire compatible. So even if you're trying to name things the same using the IPN scheme, you're never going to send a 6 bundle to a 7 device without doing some sort of NCAP, DCAP, or some kind of bridging, gatewaying, translation. Something is going to have to happen. And given you're having to do that anyway, doing name translation as part of that, I see that as a viable price to pay. So I every time I've gone through this, isn't this going to break back compatibility with Bundle Protocol version 6? There isn't. You can't hand a V7 bundle to a V6 node and expect anything rational to happen. That's my counter argument.
I don't think there's any form of compatibility there between the versions. I'm just saying, simply from a perspective of an operator on the ground that barely knows what they're talking about when they say DTN, if they see a V6 bundle and then happen to see a V7 bundle and that name is different, they have no idea what the heck that means. That could lead to confusion. And again, it's not a very high issue necessarily. It's just something I wanted to throw out there as it will most likely happen if this is the way we go forward. So is that acceptable or not?
Go ahead, Scott.
I just wanted to say something about the point you brought up a few minutes ago about requiring some change. And I certainly agree that we have to do something about changing the way the IANA registries are structured so that they accommodate the BP, the definition of the IPN scheme as presented in 9171. I don't think that necessarily entails changing the structure of the scheme specific part. But as I've said a couple times, I see value in doing that, and I'm all for it. If we did not do it, I think every node number is 64 bits, that can work. And what it does is it disadvantages people who got high ranges of node numbers. They spend more bandwidth, and there's clearly an operational disadvantage there, and I think it's worthwhile to try to address that operational disadvantage. I think it's not that addressing that is mandatory in order to get the system to work, but I think it is desirable operationally for adoption of the standard.
So while there's a stunned silence, and I actually agree with Scott there, I'm going to raise one point which appears to have slipped through reviews. So we've got it quite caught up in node numbers and naming authorities for the nodes. One piece that existed with the bundle protocol version 6 versions of IPN, so the CBHE 6020 and 7116, and God, RFC numbers. In those previous RFCs, the administrative endpoint was always service number 0. It was a must. And in RFC 9171 BP version 7, it was a may be 0. And one thing that I did put in this document was saying the service number should just be, the administrative endpoint service number should just be 0 for everyone. Has anyone got any reason, and I'm quite interested in Scott, his reasoning here of why it was a may be 0, and if anyone objects to why can't it makes so much sense for 0 to be just the admin endpoint. It makes.
I would have to reread the document to give you an answer on that. But my dim recollection is the intent was that the administrative endpoint is always, the service number is always 0. I think the language and I'd have to go back and look, I think the language in RFC 71 is that the administrative endpoint service number either is or must be 0, and therefore the administrative endpoint may be a node identifier, which is correct, right? It may be a node identifier, and there may be other node identifiers, right?
Yeah.
This is a language and wording thing. We all agree on what we want, and we can do something about clarifying the language. But I don't think there's any disagreement here.
That's good to know, because that leads me on to the second point, which came out as part of a mailing list discussion, which was if we agree that an IPN, ignoring the naming authority prefixes, you've got the node number and the service number. My understanding was that that for all EIDs on that device, all IPN EIDs on that node would have a common node number. I'm not sure that's ever written down anywhere.
That is correct. People have pointed that out, and I've thought, oh my goodness, that's true. The intent was, let me take a step back and say, if I were starting from a blank sheet of paper, I would say that nodes are identified by a node number, possibly an authority qualified node number, period. I would make node numbers a first class concept in the document and construct EIDs from them and say that the node number identifies the node, period. We have not done that. So that being the case, we could do something at some point to say all of the IPN scheme endpoints in which this node is, in which given node is a member, shall have the same, or should have the same node identifier.
Must
Well,
have.
it may be that's like, closing the barn door after the horse is gone, right? It may be too late for that. I'm not opposed to it, but I'm not sure it's doable. That is the intent. The intent is that the node identifier, whether it's qualified or not, is the identifier for the node in the IPN scheme. It's not the sole identifier for the node anyway, because the node can be identified within the DTN scheme as well. So we already have the notion that a single node may be identified by multiple different EIDs. So it's not something that you can assume that everything is going to be this node, because the node may be a member of a DTN scheme endpoint ID as well.
No, I was very specifically talking about IPN scheme EIDs.
Right. And
DTN multicast.
Yeah. I agree that this would be desirable, and if it's something that we can do, sort of logistically and in terms of and procedurally, then I'm all for it. I'm just saying I'm not certain that it is, and I'm not certain that it has to be a big problem. But
so talking procedurally, I think if we're going to make a change to IPN, we try and tackle all these things and then close the lid on IPN for at least 5 years. I don't want to come back to this in 2 years' time and say, oh, there's another update to IPN, because at that point, everybody from an implementer, the NASA guys, the JAXA guys on this call are just going to say, no, we've lost all faith in whatever you're doing, IETF.
Yeah.
For God's sake,
fair
what
enough.
are you doing?
Fair enough. If we can do that in this document, for example, then I'm perfectly fine with it. Sure.
Does anyone else have any queries, comments, requests for clarification, good ideas? Stuart, there we go. Stu, join the queue. Go for it.
So I've kept quiet because I've had nothing to contribute on the specific points under discussion, but I have another point about the draft as a whole. I'm not going to pretend, although I have read it with some care several times, that I fully understand the draft or all of its ramifications, because my involvement in the DTN working group hasn't been sufficiently deep for the last several years. But I have been involved with the host identity protocol. I can hear some of you groaning. Bob Moskowitz has been banging that drum for 20 years and almost no one has paid any attention to him. But recently, in the context of unmanned aircraft systems, we've gotten some traction using an extension of his host identity tags, hierarchical host identity tags, as the DRIP identifiers. And this brings a host of benefits, which I will not list for you now. And upon reading this draft, it appears to me that with the draft as written, I probably could take one of Bob's regional assigning authorities and declare it to be a naming authority. And I could take one of his hierarchical domain authorities and declare it to be a local naming authority. And I could use his ORCID v2 modified HIT construction procedure to create the hash and use that 64-bit hash as the 64-bit piece of all this, and have full compatibility between this naming scheme and a hierarchical host identity tag, which I will point out is also an identifier, not a locator. And I think it is very important that we subsequently address the concept of resolving identifiers to locators, but that is a separate issue, and we're focused here on identifiers. So I'm going to repeat my plea that people who are not already familiar with host identity tags and the recent extension as hierarchical host identity tags, take a look at our drone remote identification protocol working group documents and see if you agree with me that indeed we would have compatibility here. And I think that is stipulated as germane by virtue of the BOF for time variant routing, which acknowledges that we are concerned not only with spacecraft, but also with unmanned aircraft systems / rent.
Thanks, Stuart. Unsurprisingly, for those who know me and Stuart, we have discussed some of this, and yeah, that's where some of the ideas came out of conversations with Bob. So yes, it is quite nice that you can embed other methods of allocating numbers within the prefixing scheme. However, I think it is quite important to remember these are just methods of allocating numbers and at the discretion of whichever authority has the permission to allocate into a certain area. That's as far as it goes. I think I make some comment in here about not reading meaning into what these numbers are, but I will review to see whether that made the cut. Scott, go ahead, I'm rambling.
I think absolutely having a variety of ways of assigning numbers is perfectly fine. I would be a little bit concerned about using the tags that are 64 bits in length, because it would seem to me that might defeat the purposes of separating out the authority ID and thereby compressing endpoint IDs and saving bandwidth. But that point aside, I will step out of the conversation.
Okay, so I just to jump in, I was going to actually say something similar to what Scott was saying, in that I agreed that a numbering authority can number in ways that make sense to it as a numbering authority. But I think we need to resist the temptation of applying any sort of global meaning to those node numbers. If that's a method of assignment, that's terrific. But if we start overloading that and saying, and now I'm going to, that must always be the key or something like that for BPA, nodes in general to operate off of, that starts going back to coupling in a more problematic way. That was my comment. I guess with chair hat on, I have a few questions because we're getting to the end of the hour. It seems to me that an extension of the IPN scheme as the IPN scheme is something that we are generally on board with, and there are some questions associated with how that would happen. So I wanted to know, and really, Rick, what you thought, as well, of just putting up a few quick polling questions related to this, or really just asking if people are concerned. And then the other is to really understand if there are any final comments on this concept of thresholding. I certainly understand the desire to have an internal representation that is helpful and restricted in some way to 64 bits. But what I'm going over in my head is that an IANA restriction or is that like a CCSDS restriction? If CCSDS comes back and says my numbering authority is 1, and that's certainly less than 32 bits to represent, and I will allocate my node numbers and such so that I get this compression. Does that size restriction have to be on the BPv7 as a whole, or is that a tailoring that is done, for example, by CCSDS? And the reason I say that is if you look at some of the Blue Book profile adaptation for BPv7, they would say that CCSDS will only process IPN URI EIDs and not DTN URI EIDs. So there's already a concept of things we will support and things we won't support. And I'm trying to figure out what side of the fence thresholds would fall on.
Sorry, Ed, I've lost what you mean by threshold. Can you explain that in a bit more depth to me? I think I missed the supporting conversation.
Only that, and this was an email that Scott had proposed, sent to the mailing list to propose if numbering authorities are capped at 32 bits, and sub-organization IDs are capped at 16 bits, and node numbers are capped at 16 bits, then the combination of numbering authority, sub ID, and node number would always fit within 64 bits. So you could pack them into, for example, a 64-bit unsigned integer. And that has some implementation advantages.
I would suggest that that's probably a more radical change, given that the RFC 9171 and the BPv6 stuff, the predecessors all had that 2 to the power 64 range. In fact, I think the original IPN schema, given it was text, had an unlimited number of digits on these numbers. Yeah, I can see good implementation reasons. I think in the body of the text at the moment, I think under the authority numbers, I think I suggested that any numbering authorities with a number larger than 2 to the power 16, so 65536, should be private or experimental. So these would never be registered. These wouldn't be available for registration. Kind of allowing people to use them for their own purposes and not expecting them to be interoperable in any particular way, I think would have the side effect of delivering what Scott is asking for, without saying it must. So enforcing through registration rather than enforcing through rules in this document, if that makes sense.
I think enforcing through registration works fine for limiting the size of the authority numbers. If it is still possible for the authority number to be 32 bits and the assigned node number to be 64 bits, then that breaks interoperability with any implementation that has been modified expensively to handle node identifiers as structs or arrays. So I think there is, again, going back to wanting to try to preserve the applicability of DTN to work that has already been done in NASA, and not just CCSVS, but other entities that are using the existing implementations for their own purposes, maybe terrestrial and maybe space. I think it's desirable to avoid that, and I think it costs nothing, because I think there is a plausible expectation that either an authority number or an assigned node number assigned by an authority needs to be in excess of 4 billion.
I agree with you. Speaking frankly, I was trying really hard not to update RFC 9171 with this document. That's the most compelling reason I had not to start bringing in rules like that, because I really didn't want to change 9171. Because I think the perceived impact of updating bundled protocol version 7, even if all we're doing is correcting some of the number ranges for IPNs in a very specific small section, I can imagine various space agencies just throwing their hands in the air in disgust at that.
Well, if it required modification of 9171, then I think I would agree that we want not to do that. But it seems to me that by changing the scheme definition in this document, if this kind of change does not require a modification of 9171, then I don't know why imposing size limits on the elements that are defined in this document would require modification of 9071. I think it's a problem.
I take your point, and it may get as far as, if this was to be adopted and hit IESG and the IETF RFC editors, they may turn around and say, actually, this does do an update, and we can work through the politics of that. I'm very wary about altering a specification in order to manage existing implementations that predate the update. I mean, yes, there's always work for back compatibility to make sure you don't break everything, but
it would break everything. You know, that's the deal, right? It would break everything. This is, I think this is somewhat existential, right? I think.
Well,
the
counter argument.
If you require that for interoperability, all node identifiers have to essentially be 48 bytes, up to 48 bytes in length, then I think I think the problems are significant. Right, because you can have 64 bits.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm doing the count. Yes. My counter argument is I don't think any of the existing implementations are interoperable.
Oh no, that's not true at all. The existing implementations are interoperable all over the place.
With themselves, within a single
deployment.
No. They're interoperable within a LAN because they're using a single naming space.
Well,
they haven't
assumed because that's all there is right now. But that's but they are interoperable in that if their node numbers are taken from the CVAG node number allocation ranges, then they're totally interoperable. It's not an issue.
Right, I'm watching the clock. I'm also mulling over what you've just said, Scott. I'm going to stop speaking. We are out of time, ladies and gentlemen. I hope this was productive. This was very workshoppy and very conversationally. I know Scott put a post onto the mailing list I did not respond to. I'm going to take an action to put a new revision of this draft out. Taking on board all the comments that have been made on the mailing list while I was on vacation and the latest comments, and I will get that out pretty promptly and hopefully get more conversation on the list at this point and see what people think. If somebody, Scott, maybe wants to start actually Scott has started a thread about that reducing the bit width of some of these components in order to make the whole thing fit within the existing 64-bit address space. Interested in people's comments on the list to that. Otherwise, Ed, do you have anything you want to add? Otherwise, I think I'm going to do the wrap up and thank you.
Nope. Other than please keep this conversation coming on the mailing list. The goal here is to enter IETF 115 with agreements so that we can get this thing through working group last call at the next working group.
It's not been adopted yet. It's not been adopted.
So that we can get it through adoption and working group if we believe it is needed as soon as possible, going back to the beginning of the meeting where we said this is not something that should languish for a year.
Otherwise, thank you all very much for your patience. And before Meet Echo just kills us because we're 5 minutes overdue, thank you very much. Can I say a personal thank you to Carsten for the markdown tool I'm using for his Cramdown RFC tool. It's very, very good. Those of you who've never used it before, big personal thumbs up on that, Carsten. Thank you.
Thank you. I wrote it for my own use only. That was my work.
You could tell it's a tool that's been written by someone who has a need to write RFCs quickly in Markdown. It works really nicely. I'm never doing anything with any of the other XML stuff. So I'm now waffling now. Thank you all very much. I will see you all in London IETF 115, hopefully in person. Hopefully in person, if not virtually, and let's keep the conversation going on the mailing list. Thank you all very much. I shall love you and leave you.
Thank you all.